So hello everyone, it is Thursday the 4th of November in the afternoon. I'm actually just back from Glasgow where I was yesterday in connection with COP26 and I'm here now this afternoon going to have a conversation with David Rodin. And David is the founder and until recently the CEO of Principia Advisory, which is a firm that many in our firm will have heard of, with whom we worked together in late 2018 to do a survey into our culture. And a lot came out of that we may talk about in this conversation. But interestingly enough, after we finished that work, we stayed very much in touch with David and his team, and at some point worked together for quite a while in the past year, and that continues in connection with a specific report that Principia Advisory has created around business ethics. So David and I have, over the past year during the pandemic, interviewed over 50 business leaders, and I think David, with some others, has done several more, to ask them about their business ethics and about how they view, for example, purpose. We also often got to talk about ESG. And Clifford Chance has recently launched its Responsible Business Report, and the discussions David and I had with business leaders was very much about what it means to be a responsible business. So I thought it would be interesting for those in the firm and maybe those outside of Clifford Chance to hear about some of the findings of this report. What does it mean to be a responsible business? What does ethics mean in an organizational and business context? So with that introduction, let me now turn to David and say, welcome, David. Very nice to see you again. Maybe you want to add a few words to my introduction and then we can get into a bit of a discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. A real pleasure to be in conversation with you again, Jeroen. Yeah, just by way of introduction, as Jeroen has said, the founder of Principia, we're a specialist advisory group that really works on the intersection between organizational ethics and organizational culture. So my own background is I was an academic for 20 years at the University of Oxford. My special field was moral philosophy, and actually within that I did a lot of work in military ethics and the ethics of war. So I worked with armed forces and military leaders all over the world. And Principia really came out of that work as an attempt to try and bring some of the insights and research and knowledge out of academia and to make it useful and applicable to businesses and to business leaders. And the partnership that we've had with you, Jeroen, and with Clifford Chance has been a really wonderful and an enduring one that we've very, very much valued and appreciated, first of all, to work with you and to have you as a client and to be a part of your own journey towards responsible business and with the production of the code and to really be part of your journey towards building a kind of truly ethical legal business. But then also the work that we did on the ethics report as well, which was just a lot of fun and deeply rewarding and insightful to speak to business leaders across, I think it was 56 different business leaders from different organizations that we spoke to in the end, and to really take the temperature of how leaders are thinking about the ethics journey, the challenges, what they're investing in, what they feel is really succeeding, and some of the kind of pain points that they're struggling with as well.
Well, thank you, David. And we'll talk a bit later about our own journey and our own code of conduct, which we've created on the back of the work we did with you. So let's chat about that in a bit later. But now first, working together with you, I'm a lawyer, you're a moral philosopher. That was, for me, an interesting combination. I learned a lot from our discussions. But I'd be quite interested to hear a bit from you why Principia created this report, and then maybe you want to talk about some of the key findings that you've taken away from all those discussions we've had with business leaders and the others that you've had as well.
Yeah, so the motivation for the report was really, having worked with leading organizations across a range of different sectors, including, of course, law, professional services, banking, finance, technology, government, and not-for-profit, and really seeing the ways that the different organizations, different leaders were engaging with the domain of ethics, responsible business, integrity. There are a range of different words that get used, but really that same kind of core idea of how do you run a kind of truly responsible, ethical organization. We thought that the time was right to really draw together some of those strands into one place and to really provide a resource for the community that could be used to as a kind of a starting point for thinking about some of these issues, a way to get a little bit of data on what people were looking at and doing, and to share some of those stories as well. So that was really the motivation. And I think for me, some of the key things that came out of that work and out of the finding is first of all, almost universally, leaders are describing to us an environment in which ethics and the ethical domain is becoming increasingly important, both internally in terms of the structure of their own organization and interactions within the organization, and then obviously externally as well, not only with clients and with customers, but with a much broader set of stakeholders. So, what we saw in the report very clearly is that ethics responsible business is extraordinarily high on the agenda of CEOs, of boards, of C-suite executives. And that's also being driven by an increasing appreciation of the complexity of the environment that we're operating in now. So, whereas 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it was sufficient to, essentially operate in a kind of quite narrowly confined commercial basis within the restrictions of the law. That is no longer considered to be sufficient, really, by anywhere. There is increasingly a sense of a strong set of expectations that businesses will be responsive to a much broader set of ethical issues, whether that be around climate, around tax fairness, around treatment of labor, environment, racial equity, whatever they may be. But there is just a real expectation for organizations to be engaged across a range of those issues. And then secondly, a realization that creates and requires a different set of capabilities right through the organization. And I think what's very key to the way that we think about ethics is that it really should be thought of as a set of capacities, right? Both individually for leaders, for managers, for employees, but also a set of organizational capacities. And when we think about it, we think about them in terms of kind of three major areas, which we call responsibility, capability, and motivation. And what we did within the report was to dig into a lot of the different ways that leaders and organizations are working to develop capacities within those three different areas. So to give a couple of examples, so within responsibility, what we see businesses really working on is setting a clear set of expectations for their people and for themselves in terms of what their objectives are for ethical, responsible business, and then looking at ways to hold people accountable within that. So the work, for example, that you've been leading on the code of conduct, so it's very clearly within that space in terms of defining in a very clear way what expectations are for your people. Capability then has to do with the ability of managers, of leaders, of employees to actually really navigate some of these quite difficult, complicated decisions in an appropriate way, in a responsible way. So what we're seeing firms increasingly spending time on, investing in, is, for example, decision frameworks that really help guide professionals and leaders to make better decisions, particularly where there are very complex questions of trade-offs, or different interests of different stakeholder groups that are in tension with each other, and you need to get to the best ethical decision that you can within that. And then finally, kind of issues around motivation, where the idea there is that the motives and the incentives that people are exposed to have to be properly and appropriately aligned to the ethical expectations that you have of them. So it's no good telling people that you expect them to make good decisions around climate or around fair treatment of minorities, but it turns out that your bonuses or your promotion depends upon you maximizing revenues at all costs, irrespective of your impact on those other issues. So looking at the way that those incentives hopefully align with, or perhaps pull against those expectations becomes really critical. And then also within that, and a theme that I know that you've been very committed to and interested in, in your work, Jeroen, which is the issue of purpose. And what's been very interesting, and what we saw in the interviews and what we saw also in the survey for the report, is that that the definition of a really authentic purpose for the organization, that people can really feel that the organization is committed to creating a positive impact outside of their purely commercial revenue, profit generating activities, is just incredibly important across a whole set of levels for people to really feel and believe that the organization is an ethical one, is a responsible one, and then to create the motivation for them at a personal level to actually behave with integrity and in a responsible way. So I think it was really fascinating just to see through the interviews and the surveys how different organizations were adapting different strategies across these three key different areas.
David, did you see businesses, with the increased focus on being an ethical and responsible business, call it purpose-driven business as well, really that having an impact on their strategy, on choices they were making in their business lines, in their business model? And strategy is not just about what you do, but also what you don't do. Did you see real examples of that, or did you, having gone through all those interviews, and I'll ask this a little bit on purpose as a cynical question, did you feel it was more talk than walk, so to speak?
Yeah. So I think what's interesting is that we are clearly seeing an evolution of maturity towards that. And different businesses and different sectors are at different, I would say, different levels along that journey. So, for example, almost every major corporation, certainly the large ones, the FTSE 500, the global organizations, have done something around purpose. They will have a purpose statement. They will have some activities around that. They will, their CEO will be speaking about it at Davos and other venues. So at that level, and there have been some very high profile. The US Business Roundtable has made their statement around that. Many investors have also spoken very, very significantly around that. So there's that kind of baseline level of yes, we've thought about purpose, we've articulated, we have it. But it's that next level, exactly as you say, of connecting the purpose in a meaningful way to the decisions that the organization is taking at a strategic level, at an operational level, and then also, driving that down, that it really feels real and authentic to employees within the organization, that they not only believe that it is more than hot air, but they also are able to connect their own role and their own activities to it. And I would say that actually very, very few organizations have really done that in a truly effective way. But I think what I think we're now in that kind of second phase where organizations are starting to really work and to devote resource to doing exactly that. So to taking a purpose statement and making it actually into a decision framework, a set of metrics. So the focus on measuring outcomes was a very, very significant and important theme that came out of both the survey and the conversations. So I think I think we are seeing a journey, but I think that is clearly the kind of the second phase of where this work is going to be going.
Yeah, and I recognize that, David. I mean, in one sense, the famous sentence, you get what you measure, so to speak. So having your incentives and your KPIs aligned to that, responsible business setting, ethical business purpose is important. Otherwise, it remains sort of, or it becomes, I should say, maybe purpose washing. And were there examples, and I don't know, you may want to name names, you don't have to, but you've seen examples in the process of that report of businesses who've done this very, very well, where you feel it's really been embedded right through the organization and is driving actually the business and the business models and the performance throughout all levels of the organization. Did you see examples of that?
Yeah, so I mean, the conversation that we had with Alan Jupp at Unilever is, I think, a great example of that. There are many others. I mean, the climate commitments, you mentioned COP26 at the outset. Many very significant organizations have made commitments now around net zero for 2050. Again, I think we're seeing a range of maturity in terms of the hardness of those commitments, the capacity to measure those, the capacity to deliver those, first of all, in terms of internal emissions, but then secondly, also thinking about, the secondary emissions that come from the clients that you work with. And so, I think we are seeing, again, variable maturity on that, but I think a lot of real movement and real commitment around that. I mean, to give another example of a company that we know very well, Accenture, I think, has been doing some really terrific work around this. I think, in terms of the responsible business report that I know that you're launching now, I think is also those kinds of ways of communicating, openly with your stakeholder groups, are just a very, very important way of making sure that you can be held accountable to the commitments that you're making amongst your stakeholders.
Well, thank you, and no, that interview with Alan Duke was fantastic. And as I said, I've just come back from COP, which is ongoing. This is the fourth day of it. It's going on until the 12th of November. I think one of the differences between the Paris Agreement, or the COP, which led to the Paris Agreement, and this one, I am told, because I wasn't there at the time, so I'm not pretending to be, but I was told that now the involvement of business is so much greater, and this is really a change. It can be driven by business, but it needs governments with regulations to set the proper guide rails, have standardized metrics, and really, create a level playing field and a fair playing field, and be the referee. But then the businesses are ready to go, because they don't just see this as the right thing to do. They see it's good for their business models, or can be good as well. So we had some very interesting discussions over a dinner last night, actually. But moving away from COP, just going to the work we did together. I mean, you came and worked with us back in 2018. I remember you telling me that what you liked in a way was that very often clients you work with came to you, or come to you, when they had a crisis, when something happened. And we didn't, in touch wood. We came to you because we just wanted to do a deep dive into our culture. And so that was slightly different. I'm glad we did that. And we'll talk about what came out of it in a minute, but I'd be quite interested to hear what your finding was, what you remember. I know it's 2 years back, but coming into our organization, what your and please be completely open and honest. I mean, it doesn't have to be a nice and friendly answer. I mean, what did you see?
Yeah, so it was really interesting and really refreshing for us, because the early years of our business, almost everybody who came to us had come to us because they had some kind of very significant ethics, conduct related crisis. And these were often, thinking about some of the work that we did in the banking sector with, some of the big global banks. These have become almost existential for these companies. Right? They've almost gone out of business. Some of them have been operating for 100 years or more. And so there was a kind of laser-like focus because of this intense pressure from regulators, from the board. It was very clear to everyone that something was broken and needed to be fixed and transformed in a very, very structural way. And so, the question, what we do in cases like that is we help boards and managements to diagnose and understand where the problems are, and then really create a consensus around that, and then create a strategic plan to regenerate and transform. And what was wonderful about working with you is that you came to us having not had a crisis or a set of issues like that, but with a very kind of honest view, saying, look, tell us what you see, tell us what we're good at, but more importantly, maybe tell us the issues and the problems that you see, because we really want to get better. We view this first of all as a competitive positioning, within the market, but also because we want to be a responsible, ethical firm, and we want to develop the ability to do that better. And I think what was great about that as well is that I think you had clearly understood that in order to take the kinds of steps that have led you now, to the code of conduct and the other activities that you're undertaking, that it's really important to understand the steady state. And I think that was very much in your thinking of partnering with us and working with us. So if you'll remember, we spent about 4.5 months, 5 months, I think, doing rolling out a survey across the global firm, across everybody within the organization, and then doing a series of interviews and focus groups across key global offices for you. And what that enabled us to do was, I think, to read back to you, where across those set of capabilities that we were talking about before, Clifford Chance was already, really doing very well, and where there were potential weaknesses. And I think, what was really, really apparent was that, first of all, you had an incredibly smart, engaged, and dedicated group of professionals worldwide who really believed in the firm, really had a great deal of affection towards the firm, and who kind of believed in the profession of law. And that was just really apparent, as soon as we came into the organization. But, what we also saw were some of the strains and stresses and vulnerabilities. And also, having worked in the professional services sector as well, many of these were elements that we had seen in other professional sector firms as well. So one of them that came out very, very clearly was this issue around speak up and readiness to speak up. And I know that that's become one of the 5 key elements within the code of conduct. And what's interesting is that when you look within organizations, as I said, this is not something that's unique to Clifford Chance. You find it across many, many organizations. But I think particularly within partnerships, within professional services firms, where relationships are so important, and relationships to your partner and the way that you progress within a firm, that can create all kinds of impediments to speaking up honestly, or to talking about something when you see a problem, because you're just tied so closely to those relationships. So that was one thing that I think we saw very, very clearly. We also noticed a set of issues that were just around the incredibly competitive labor market that you're in. That you are in a very, very high stress, high tempo operating environment. You ask a lot of your people, your clients ask a lot of you. That creates, a kind of constant pressure to ask people to do more. And environments where, where people are really very, very stretched, that can obviously create vulnerabilities, because it can be hard for people to put their hands up and say, actually, I'm drowning a bit here, I need a little bit more time. Or in really bad cases, not to say that we saw evidence of this within Clifford Chance, but it creates pressure or a risk that sometimes people may cut corners, just because it's easier to do that. So those were 2 things that I think came out of the conversations and out of the survey, that we were able to really read back to you. And I remember those readbacks with Matthew and with other members of the executive team and of the board, that I think it enabled you to really look at those, identify them. And I know you spent a lot of time really acclimatizing the organization to those results and talking about them really, really openly and honestly, and using those to kind of get alignment around the steps that you were going to be taking forward, which I think was just a terrific way to do it. Because believe me, having worked with a number of executive teams managing the aftermath of a crisis, that is absolutely not where you want to be.
Well, thanks for that, David. And working with you on those interview series, your primary goal was to get input for the report you were writing, which we were sort of supporting you on. But at the same time, we were very open in all the interviews that the reason I was on, apart from that, was to listen to business leaders, how they were doing it, how were they implementing their thoughts around being an ethical business, how were they making sure that was embedded in the business, and to take ideas from that. And I was always quite open. And I remember Alan Droop saying, I love supporting it in the context of a report, but I'm really very interested also in your journey at Clifford Chance. Is another reason for me to be talking to you. And I remember one interview, for example, with Wiebe Dreyer, who is the CEO of Rabobank in the Netherlands, how he had taken ideas, I think, from his times at McKinsey, how they had around their ethics and their values, they had every year a week in which they sort of almost repledged and realigned themselves to that. It's one of the thoughts we have in the firm as well. So I was taking ideas previous interviews at the same time. And Speak Up was a very big one. And in the workshops we run around our code of conduct, actually, the topic of Speak Up is probably the one that creates the most debate and dialogue about how do you actually do that effectively, because it's very difficult for the reasons you mentioned, the strong relations, but just generally also in your private life, if you see things which you want to say something, it's not always easy. So we talk about that very openly. Now, I know I shared the code of conduct with you, just to be clear for anyone watching this. We took the work we did with you, David, but then took it away and worked on it ourselves further. So the code of conduct was created by ourselves, having listened to the outcome of the work you did, but was not something that you wrote with us or provided input on. I did share it with you, and the 5 principles of the code are act with integrity, because we've thought, if you don't act with integrity as an individual and as an organization, and certainly as a law firm, the rest is actually pretty meaningless. And the second one was to be inclusive. And the third one, and this goes to the Speak Up culture a bit and the entrepreneurial spirit of our firm as well, is to embrace challenge and to speak up. There's a number 3 and 4. And then number 5 is act responsibly, which is about, first of all, and all these 5 principles, so act with integrity, be inclusive, embrace challenge, speak up, and act responsibly, they apply to us as individuals in the firm, but at the same time, they also apply to the firm as an institution as a whole. So the firm has to act with integrity, the firm has to be inclusive, obviously made up of the people within it, and the firm has to act responsibly. So not just me as an individual or anyone in the firm as an individual. Now, what does it mean to act responsibly as a firm? For us, that means to be committed to supporting a just, fair, sustainable and prosperous society, and to consider the impacts of our work, not just directly on our clients, but on their wider stakeholders and the wider communities they operate in, and to help them with that. And finally, to respect human rights and actually do no harm. And those are not just empty words. So we've got all sorts of policies now underlying that and have a lot of dialogue around that. And it's interesting because lawyers are a different breed to some other professional service firms, consultants, or other businesses. I mean, we are lawyers. We are there also for access to justice, the rule of law. And that brings with itself some dynamics. And I'm a litigator. I've been trained. Anyone is entitled to a good defense, and you want to help people in that sense. So we've got very interesting dialogues around that in the firm, but it is driving increasingly strategy, what we do and can't do. And as we say, we don't have to be agnostic in the world and things we're seeing today, whether it's around climate, whether it's around social inequality, and how do you organize the governance around that as a business. So wondering whether there's a question in that. I'm sort of replaying in my own head what we've done, taking away the results of what we work with you. But interesting question, whether you, with these 5 principles, do you feel, and we've never talked about this before for the audience, this is not a prepared sort of question and answer. I'm just wondering, do you feel that those 5 principles sort of resonate with what you saw in the work we've done together? I would hope you say yes to that.
Yeah. No, exactly. And so I really like a lot of what you've done with this process, kind of going from our report and using this code of conduct as a way to engage in these conversations and kind of frame these debates within the organization. I think you've done a terrific job. And I think, the 5 principles themselves, there's nothing particularly earth-shattering about them. You would find many of those in the codes of many other organizations. But what I like about the approach that you've taken is, first of all, you did start from a basis of data and understanding coming out of a report. Secondly, you really took the time to engage the organization, from saying, okay, we've had this outside and read from Principia, we've got an understanding of our strengths, but also the things that we need to work on. What are the kind of commitments that we want to hold ourselves to? So you had that kind of inclusive process leading into it. And then, I think, just in terms of the way that you frame the document, you kind of have the general principles, but then you have examples of behaviors that fit within that. So, again, this, when we work with organizations on this, we always advise to have that kind of framing, to say, what we want you to internalize is not a set of, 15 million rules, but a basic kind of set of orientations or expectations, and some examples that help you go on from there. So I think there's a lot to like about the way that you've you've approached it. But at the end of the day, what makes something like this work and live, and you only use that term, a living document, is the way that your people use it and engage with it. And one observation I would make is, when you look at the values that organizations proclaim, what you often find is that there's a mixture between what I call descriptive values and aspirational values. So descriptive values are the ones that your people will look around and they will say, yes, I recognize that Clifford Chance is an organization that acts with integrity. That's the organization that I see around me. But there are other values which are perhaps only partially being lived in the organization at the moment. And it can still be really important to have those as values that you kind of, you talk about, but they have a very different role to play, right? They're the things that perhaps we're not all the way there yet. And what I always tell clients is it's incredibly important to be clear about, when you talk about a value for the firm, which of those is a descriptive value and which of those is an aspirational value. Because if you tell people that these are the values that the firm has, and they look around and they say, well, actually, we say that we're an open communicating firm, but I look at the people around me and clearly we're not doing that. Then that starts to corrode the belief in the, in what the firm is telling you, and this idea of values. And we do this actually within Principia. So every 6 months, we talk about our values. We say, what are the values that you really see, being lived within the organization, and what are the values that we need to pay attention to, because maybe we're not doing them quite as well as we did, or maybe that we need to get to a better stage on. So if I think about your values, I think integrity probably absolutely is descriptive. Speak up probably has a dimension of being aspirational and a dimension of being descriptive. I think it's really important just to be open about that, to say, look, it's incredibly important for us to get, to a really, really open speak up culture. We're probably not all of the way there yet, but how do we get to really being where we want to be? But just being very explicit about, the different ways and the different roles that values can play.
Well, thanks, David. I mean, again, for the audience, that's not something we've been discussing before, but actually I think, and I'd like to think, that is the way when we run the workshops, we talk about it. So, the first pillar I talk about is I think, and I do think, and I've been with the firm for 30 years, we've got a great culture, but I recognize, my lived experience, first of all, may be different from that of other people in the firm. Secondly, having a great culture doesn't mean we can be complacent. There's always areas in which we can improve and which are more aspirational. So that partly goes to your point. And then indeed, being inclusive. I think we're working hard at being inclusive on a day-to-day basis. We've got, apart from the sort of diversity, equity and inclusion program, but just on a day-to-day basis, are we inclusive? But again, clearly areas we can sometimes improve on, and certainly is picking up one. And I use examples about, and I said earlier, how difficult it can be. And, I'm from the Netherlands, from Amsterdam, and I always say people are quite direct in Amsterdam. So I always felt we had a reasonably good speak up culture. And I've actually been corrected, after the workshop. Sometimes people called me and said, Jeroen, you've been in that office for a long time. You've been partner in the office for a long time. You've managed the office. My lived experience in the office in Amsterdam is actually different. And I don't think we always have a healthy speak up culture. We can get better. So, your lived experience may be more positive than mine. I still think we've got a pretty good culture there, but, it is in part aspirational. And I think actually the profession of law, for the reasons you mentioned, very much relationship building business and relation building business, I think suffers across the board from sometimes lacking that open culture. I think we're not doing badly at all, but it's very clear we can do better.
I would 100% agree with that. And, these issues can sometimes, they can hide in funny places, and you can be doing great on one dimension of the value, but have issues that are kind of not so easy to appreciate. So, I think, around speak up, certainly people can be very comfortable speaking up about one kind of issue, but then just find others very difficult for some, in some ways. I think another example is around inclusion. So, one of the ways where inclusion challenges, and maybe people might not think about this in these ways, and when you kind of use that word inclusion. But I remember one of the things that came out in the survey and the conversations was just the kind of the tension or the differential between lawyers in the firm and support staff. and the sense, amongst some of those who were incredibly high-performing professionals in their own right, but the sense that it was always first and foremost about the lawyers. And that is an inclusion issue at the end of the day, right? Although it might not be one that you kind of immediately jump to think about.
Yes, and the same with, that's one of them, generationally, all these sorts of things. Do you create an environment where, the youngest in the room feels free to challenge? And that's what we also talk about Embrace Challenge, to get diversity of thought in the room. Anyway, David, I think we should probably come to an end because we could talk about this for another 2 hours, I know. So it was a very informal conversation. This was done in the context of us launching our responsible business report for our financial year 21, so the one which went from April 20 to April 1st of May 21, which we have just launched. And I would encourage anyone watching this to have a look on our website at the Responsible Business Report. I think there's a lot of, I would say, great stuff in there. I think acting responsibly, going back to the beginning and to the reasons for your report, David, is increasingly important, and I think as a law firm we can be leading in that area, which is part of the journey we are on, and I think it's increasingly driving strategy as well. So I want to thank you for the work we did and working together, and looking forward to doing more interviews together of other people.
Absolutely, absolute pleasure. Thank you, Ren.
Thank you.